So people say, oh, there's no connection between Israel and the war in Iraq. Bullshit. That is bullshit. And then you had all these lobbyists who were once trying to guide Netanyahu, and then they were in the US government guiding American foreign policy to do exactly what they told Netanyahu would be a benefit to Israel's foreign policy, and that was to overthrow Saddam Hussein. There is absolutely a direct connection between the pro-Israel lobby and American churchianity and the US government. It's all interconnected. All right, everyone. So I want to talk to you guys about how Zionists are controlling and how they are really dominating the American Christian conservative movement, and how this connects to the United States government, and how really it connects to American foreign policy. So I just want to begin with some anecdotes from my own experience, because these stories really do tell us about what has been happening in light of American conservatism. So I remember years and years ago, there was a guy by the name of James Woolsey. And James Woolsey was once the head of the CIA back in the 1990s. And James Woolsey, he was very active in the American Christian church world. He would speak at churches. And I know this because many years ago, we're talking back in the early 2000s, so 2006, somewhere around there, I remember going to this big Christian Zionist event, this big Christian Zionist conference. It's known as CUFI, which is an acronym that stands for Christians United for Israel, and it's something that is led by John Hagee and his whole movement. It's just one big giant Zionist rally that's there to convince Christians to just follow Israel no matter what, because if they don't, they're not going to be blessed by God, that sort of thing. It's part of this pro-Israel Christian cult. But I remember going to this event, and there was a massive crowd. This was back in the day when Christian Zionism was actually very popular, unlike now when it's losing popularity. And there was James Woolsey, and he was on the stage telling people about how America needs to fight against the terrorists and how we need to have this war on terrorism. And he was supporting the Iraq war. And he talked about how, well, you know, in the Western world, we respect women. And of course, he is a massive supporter of Israel, and he was there to support Israel. And he was talking about how in the Islamic world, you know, they're all just a bunch of sexists and blah, blah, blah. You know, the whole thing about how we have to fight the barbarian hordes, that sort of thing. Everybody was clapping their hands. It was just one giant clap fest. I didn't know who James Woolsey was. I remember seeing him up on stage, but I didn't know that he was once the head of the CIA back in the 1990s, from 1993 to 1995 to be specific. Later on, I found out, well, this guy actually used to lead the CIA. So what is a former head of the CIA doing talking to churches about why people should support Israel and why people should support the war on terror? And what was this guy doing? Telling people to support the war in Iraq and all this stuff. And so you begin to see the connection between the US government and American Christian Zionism. You see it right there. It's very blatant. It's very obvious. Sometime later, we're talking years later, my dad went to this church event. And this was I want to say this was in the state of Alabama. And my dad was at this church. And before the event happened, the pastor asked my dad to come into his office. He wanted to discuss something with my dad. Whatever. And so my dad was heading towards this guy's office. And as my dad is getting closer to the door, out comes this guy. And guess who it is? It's James Woolsey, the former head of the CIA. He's coming out of the pastor's office. And my dad said, "Hey, James, what are you doing here?" And he said, "Oh, nothing. You know, I'm just doing a speaking event, etc., etc." And so there was James Woolsey, this former head of the CIA, at yet another church event. What's going on? what's happening? There is a blatant connection between the American church industry and the U.S. government. There is a blatant connection between American Christian Zionism and the U.S. government. So you look at that, it makes you wonder what is happening here. The Zionists, be they Jewish or be they non-Jewish, it doesn't matter. The Zionists, they want to make sure that they have their hands on everything. Christianity, the conservative movement, they want to make sure that all these Americans, all of these goyim, are going to support Israel. Because once the goyim stop supporting Israel, once the goyim, once the non-Jews, once the Americans, once the Westerners become disillusioned with Israel, or they become indifferent to Israel, and they stop supporting Israel would no longer be politically advantageous for politicians. Politicians would be saying, well, what's the point of me supporting Israel? I'm going to lose votes if I support Israel. So the Zionist movement, the Zionist cause, the pro-Israel lobby, whatever you want to call it, wants to make sure that it has its hands on everything, especially the Christian world, because the majority of Americans identify as some type of Christian. So they want to make sure that they have enough influence in the American Christian world. And who is James Woolsey? As I have already said, this guy was once the head of the CIA, but this guy also was one of the biggest pushers, for the war in Iraq. And James Woolsey was pushing this fabricated story that said that there was a connection between Saddam Hussein and the 9/11 attack. Because remember, back in 2001, when 9/11 happened, everyone was freaking out, everyone was traumatized, and they all wanted to get to the bottom of it. The average American just wanted to find out who was behind 9/11 so that the U.S. government could just kill the perpetrator. And it didn't matter what the government said. We would believe it. The government could come out and say, well, it was Iraq, and we all supported the war in Iraq. They wanted to make this connection between 9/11 and Iraq because they wanted people to support the war in Iraq. And so James Woolsey was trying to make this connection. And he emphatically affirmed that there was a connection between 9/11 and Saddam Hussein. And there was no connection, but he was pushing this story that came out of the Czech Republic at the time. And this story said that an Iraqi intelligence agent met with Mohammed Atta in the country of the Czech Republic, in the city of Prague. And this is what Woolsey was saying. He was saying, yep, there was an Iraqi intelligence agent. He went to Prague and he met with Mohammed Atta. And so that proves that there is a direct link between Saddam Hussein's government and 9/11, and this proves that Saddam Hussein was behind 9/11, and this is why we have to invade Iraq. And the New York Times went with this and talked about this report from the Czech Republic, and then later on, the New York Times had to retract what they wrote, and the New York Times had to publish another article correcting what they wrote. This whole story of this Iraqi intelligence agent meeting with Mohammed Atta was a complete fabrication. It was nonsense. It was made up. It was a made-up lie to justify invading Iraq and doing regime change. And James Woolsey and Dick Cheney were some of the biggest figureheads pushing that story. So James Woolsey pushes for the war in Iraq. And then as the war in Iraq is taking place and we're all praising the troops and saying, hoorah, hoorah, bomb Iraq, James Woolsey is going to the churches, he's going to Kufi, he's going to the big pro-Israel events, and he's telling the American people to praise Israel and to praise the war in Iraq. There is indeed a connection here between the CIA, between the US government, between the pro-Israel movement. It's all connected. All of it is connected. And James Woolsey was a part of a circle of other neoconservative Zionists who were pushing for the war in Iraq. And I just want to read to you guys an excerpt from this book. This is from The Israel Lobby by John Mearsheimer. And if you guys have not read this book, I highly recommend that you do, because it is an extremely informative read. I read this book back in 2018. I think it came out in 2007. But it is a very informative read on the Israel lobby and how influential it is. And so it says here that the driving force behind the Iraq war was a small band of neoconservatives who had long favored the energetic use of American power to reshape critical areas of the world, especially the Middle East. Ooh, I wonder why. Because it was to the benefit of Israel. They had advocated toppling Saddam since the mid-1990s and believed this step would benefit the United States and Israel alike. This group included prominent officials in the Bush administration, such as Paul Wolfowitz and Douglas Faith, the number 2 and 3 civilians in the Pentagon, Richard Pearl, Kenneth Adelman, and James Woolsey, members of the influential Defense Policy Board. So James Woolsey, Richard Pearl, Kenneth Adelman, Paul Wolfowitz, Douglas Faith, they were all a part of this pro-Israel circle, and they were all pushing for the war in Iraq back in the 1990s. They were all pushing for this stuff. And James Woolsey was the head of the CIA in the mid-1990s. So there is definitely a connection between the intelligence world, the think tank world, the Pentagon, the pro-Israel movement, the pro-Israel lobby, and the American church industry. The American church industry is a part of this whole equation. And if you look at the foundation for America's evil and murderous and violent pro-Israel policy, wherein the United States can watch Israel just butcher people by the tens of thousands and butcher civilians, and even go so far as to butcher starving people as they're queuing for food outside of aid distribution zones. What is the foundation for America's cruelty and callousness towards Palestinian suffering? It's the pro-Israel crowd, which dominates the American evangelical world. And the American evangelical world is the biggest Christian sect in America. The majority of American quote-unquote Christians identify as evangelical, non-denominational, and the majority of these people support Israel. And all of these people vote Republican, which is why Republican politicians, when they're campaigning, they have such a huge incentive to be pro-Israel, because they know that's going to please and appeal to their evangelical constituents, their evangelical voters. So they have to be pro-Israel. And the pro-Israel lobby, the Zionist movement, wants to make sure the Israeli government, really, let's be perfectly accurate here, the Israeli government needs these evangelicals. And the Israeli government needs for these evangelicals to be pro-Israel, because as long as they're pro-Israel, those Republican politicians are going to have an incentive to be a sycophant towards Israel. But you go back to the 1990s, and there is James Woolsey, who was once the head of the CIA. He's working with Richard Pearl. And look at what it says here. This is amazing. So Woolsey was working with Richard Pearl. He was in cahoots with Richard Pearl. And look at what it says here. Douglas Faith was a co-author along with Richard Pearl and David Wormser of the famous Clean Break Report in June of 1996. So let's talk about the Clean Break Memo, or the Clean Break Report. The Clean Break Report was a Zionist plan that was co-authored by, as I've already said, people like Douglas Faith, David Wormser, Richard Pearl. And they wrote the Clean Break Memo, or the Clean Break Report, on behalf of an Israeli think tank that was dedicated to guiding Prime Minister Netanyahu when he just became a brand new prime minister in Israel. And they were trying to guide Israeli foreign policy. And look at what it says here. It says here, written under the auspices of a right-wing Israeli think tank for incoming Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the report recommended, among other things, that Netanyahu focus on removing Saddam Hussein from power in Iraq, an important Israeli strategic objective in its own right. So Richard Pearl and David Wormser and Douglas Faith were pushing Netanyahu to overthrow the Saddam Hussein regime. And we all know what happened as a result of overthrowing Saddam. You had a complete destabilization of Iraq, which boiled over into Syria, and this led to the deaths of countless lives. At least 1 million people were killed in Iraq. If you include Syria, it's even more. It's hundreds of thousands of people were butchered in Syria as a result of the civil war that was caused by the destabilization of Iraq. That's how much destruction this caused. And the destabilization of Iraq and Syria enabled the rise of Turkey. And now we're seeing this rising, reviving Turkish power in the Middle East. And that is a result of what the Zionists were pushing in the 1990s. So here were these pro-Israel lobbyists trying to guide Israeli policy. And then what happened? Richard Pearl, Douglas Faith, David Wormser, Paul Wolfowitz, this whole crowd of lobbyists began to dictate American foreign policy. And what did they push the United States to do? Before 9/11, this had nothing to do with 9/11. They used 9/11 as a pretext. But before 9/11, they were pushing the United States to overthrow Saddam Hussein. The thing is that the United States government did not have the pretext that it needed to get the American people behind such a ginormous feat, such a massive policy. 9/11 happened, bam, the United States got its pretext. That's what happened. The pro-Israel lobby, Wolfowitz, Wormser, Faith, Pearl, all these guys, they said, we have our pretext, we have our green light, and they pushed for the war in Iraq, and it happened. James Woolsey was a part of that crowd. And James Woolsey would go on to speak in churches to get the Christians to praise the Iraq war. It's all interconnected. It's all interconnected. In the 1990s, the pro-Israel lobby, Pearl, Wormser, Faith, Wolfowitz, these guys, they were pushing for the overthrowing of Saddam Hussein. They were telling the Israelis overthrowing Saddam Hussein would be a massive benefit to Israel because it would destabilize Iraq. It would make Israel more powerful because Israel wouldn't have a powerful Iraq to worry about, thus enabling Israel to become a more dominating force in the region. And the Clean Break Memo also talked about overthrowing the Assad regime and containing Syria. And it even talked about changing the borders of Syria. And that's what Israel's trying to do right now. That's why you have an Israeli occupation taking place in southern Syria, because Israel is trying to rearrange the borders of Syria. And they have said that this is not a conspiracy theory. They have actually said this. Israel has said that they want to break Syria down into multiple cantons. They want to destroy the unity of Syria. They want to destroy whatever is left of the unity of Syria. And this goes back to the Clean Break report that was written by the pro-Israel lobby in the 1990s. And so you see this plan being done today. And so they were pushing for this policy of overthrowing Saddam back in the 1990s. And then fast forward to the early 2000s, and they were telling America to do exactly what they were telling Netanyahu would be a benefit for Israel. And that was to overthrow Saddam Hussein. And it happened. So people say, oh, there's no connection between Israel and the war in Iraq. Bullshit. That is bullshit. Absolute, utter bullshit. Netanyahu was pushing for the war in Iraq.
If you take out Saddam's regime, I guarantee you that it will have enormous positive reverberations on the region.
Ariel Sharon was pushing for it. All these Israeli politicians were pushing for it. Ehud Barak was pushing for it. And then you had all these lobbyists who were once trying to guide Netanyahu, and then they were in the U.S. government guiding American foreign policy to do exactly what they told Netanyahu would be a benefit to Israel's foreign policy, and that was to overthrow Saddam Hussein. There is absolutely a direct connection between the pro-Israel lobby and American churchianity and the U.S. government. It's all interconnected.